Yesterday, something bizarre happened in Gorton and Denton and Gorton, whatever. Not just a by-election, it's not just a swing or a protest vote, this was an earthquake. You see, in 2019, Labour held 67.2% of the vote share, a fortress, untouchables, and then the Conservatives had just less than 20%. Then, in 2024, Labour's dropped down to 50.8%. Now, gone down to 25%. So the other, 40% of that left-wing vote has moved across to the Greens, and the Conservatives, they've gone from just under 20% to less than 2% with Reform consolidating everything that's on the right. So just read that again. From 67% down to 25%, from 19% down to literally nothing. That's not normal fluctuation. That's not midterm blues. That is complete structural collapse of the mainstream parties. And the reason is simple. For years, the so-called opposition has looked suspiciously like the government and vice versa. Red or blue, the script doesn't change. The tone changes, they'll tell you a few little things that they'll never do. The slogans change, the sound bites change, the ties change, but the direction of travel across the whole of the country goes exactly the same way. This is a managed decline straight into the ground, dressed up as stability. The borders, they get softened either way. The economic policy, it gets tweaked around the edges, but it never really hits the target. And then these global institutions that we talk about, they're revered without question. Nobody asks who they are, how they've been elected, why they have such an influence on our lives. The cultural upheaval that we see in all our towns and villages across the UK, it's managed, it's not debated, it's just silenced. So what happens when people look at the ballot paper and they see two brands selling the exact same product, much like the newspapers today? They go, what's the point? I'm just going to walk away. I'm not going out today in the rain, standing at that polling station, getting all these leaflets through my door for it to make zero difference. They don't drift gently from the centre. They go very, very quickly. Just leave it. I can't be bothered. There's no point in politics. But they move outwards. They start to become more fractured. Imagine an accordion, one of those things like the blokes who play in the street, in and out, in and out. For years and years, it's been squeezed tighter and tighter into the middle. Every note is a bit more of a compression. Every difference has just been flattened out. Every argument diluted. And then the pressure's released, boom! And it's expanded out so violently to its full extension. On the left, you've got the Greens who absorb everything that Labour, has lost because they think that it's lost its moral fire. On the right, you've got the Reform, which is taking all of the sort of traditional conservative nationalist group who feel that they've been betrayed by their politicians. And now you've got this massive vacuum in the middle. And that's where, conviction and debate and sensibility used to live. But the problem is that vacuums in politics never stay empty for long. So something is going to fill that, and we need to be honest with ourselves. This isn't just left versus right anymore. It's globalist versus nationalist, institution versus insurgent, security versus fluidity, managerial politics versus emotional politics. And underneath that is something far more volatile, and that's our identity. Because when people feel unheard economically, they start speaking culturally, ethnically. When people feel powerless, what they do is they retreat into their tribes. And you see that everywhere now. And this is where, politics stops being about tax and starts being about who belongs and who's in whose group. And that's where, the conversation shifts entirely from policy to identity. And once identity becomes the battlefield, compromise becomes betrayal. You become a traitor because you're not sticking with your tribe. And this is a massive danger zone, because if you can feel it in the language that we've heard over the last few weeks up in, Denton and Gorton. It's angry, it's distrustful, and people just generally don't like politicians anymore. They despise the whole structure. They feel mocked, they feel ignored, and they feel like the decisions that are being made in rooms that they'll never be allowed to enter by people who will never live with the consequences are affecting them so greatly that they just want to burn the whole thing down. And so what do? They reach for alternatives. Not because the alternatives are perfect, but because the old guard is finished. And here's the deeper question. Is this polarisation or is this realignment? You see, British politics has not always just been the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. It's reinvented itself repeatedly over and over, much like that accordion. You know, parties have died before, new forces have risen up from the ashes, and what looks like chaos one year or one decade becomes the new normal for the next generation. So maybe what we're actually watching is the death of the two-party system that's been in its comfort zone for the last, 25, 30 years. Maybe we're watching the birth of something much more fragmented, but much more honest, much more aligned with the values and standards of the groups that they represent. And that's fine, but this is what really concerns me. Fragmentation feels empowering at first, because it's like, yes, they're finally listening to us. They understand my concerns. They understand my community. It feels like a rebellion. It feels like awakening, that we're taking control back. But everything that stretches outwards without restraint, you know, until it becomes so polarised that people are just in these divided camps and little, balkanised states across the country. What's going to hold us together? You see, in the military, you know, unity isn't a slogan, it is an absolute necessity for survival. You've got men and, you know, women from across the country, different ethnic backgrounds, different races, different religions, and they're all tied together, not through any sort of shared ideology, but through hardship, a shared mission, a shared risk, shared trauma. And, you know, at the end of the day, you don't ask the man next to you how he voted. You ask whether he's going to support you and protect you in a firefight. Cohesion is forged in fire. So I ask you this, as a country, do we need to go down that route first? And I've been there, trust me, it's not an enjoyable experience, but do we need to go down that route of like civil disorder and, you know, absolute chaos before we rediscover each other? Do we need a crisis before we remember what binds us, or can we learn from the pain of others without repeating ourselves? Because here's the truth that no politician wants to say out loud. A nation cannot survive indefinitely without a shared culture and a shared experience.